The mountain banners cut through the smoke outside Beijing in 1630. Troops from Sichuan marched past the gates while the capital braced for collapse. At Pingtai, the Chongzhen emperor summoned their commander. The court saw a woman holding the tally of command. Suspicion filled the hall. He did not dismiss her. He wrote 4 imperial poems in her honor. In a dying empire, competence outranked custom. If she could hold the line, she belonged at the center. They did not yet know how long she had been fighting. For more than 3 decades before she stood at Pingtai, Qin Liangyu had commanded men in terrain where imperial banners rarely lasted. She did not inherit a ceremonial title and step into safety. She built authority in marches measured by mud, stone, and blood. The late Ming state was already under strain. Grain shipments faltered. Silver drained toward distant fronts. Reports from the northeast described a rising power beyond the passes. In the interior, tax burdens and failed harvests pushed farmers toward rebellion. The empire was not collapsing in a single blow. It was thinning everywhere at once. The system responded with a compromise. It leaned on the Tusi. Under this arrangement, local chieftains governed frontier regions in exchange for loyalty and troops. The court accepted distance in return for manpower. It was not equality. It was necessity. Qin Liangyu entered that system through marriage in 1595. Ma Qiancheng Tusi of Shizhu commanded warriors from the Tujia highlands. The land was steep and broken, cut by ravines and narrow paths. Authority there did not rest on edicts alone. It rested on discipline and protection. She did not remain a figure behind the curtain. She trained with the troops. She studied formations. She revised drills. She worked beside her husband in strengthening a regional force that answered both to Shizhu and to the Ming throne. Power came before recognition. When rebellion erupted in Bozhou at the end of the 16th century, she marched with 3,500 Shizhu soldiers. Mountain fortresses blocked the advance. Standard infantry struggled against the slopes. Qin Liangyu drove her forces upward. 7 engagements ended in victory. The rebel leader died by his own hand. The southwest stabilized for a time. Success did not protect her family from the court. Ma Qiancheng later died in prison after accusations driven by eunuch politics. The center consumed its own defenders. Qin Liangyu did not retreat into private mourning. She assumed full command of Shizhu's forces. The tally passed to her hands not as ornament but as obligation. Then the northeast ignited. The later Jin state pressed against Liaodong. In 1621, her brothers led white pole troops north to support imperial armies. At the Hun River, they faced elite Manchu cavalry. The ground was open. The enemy was fast. The Shizhu soldiers held position and fought until they were overwhelmed. Qin Bengping fell in battle. Qin Minping withdrew wounded. Loss clarified the stakes. If she withdrew, Shizhu would survive. If she continued, her house would bleed. She chose continuation. She led 3,000 more troops northward to reinforce the passes. She moved across provinces toward Shanhai Pass, where the empire narrowed between wall and sea. Her presence was not symbolic. She commanded men, managed supplies, and stabilized sectors that imperial regulars could not hold alone. By 1630, the threat reached Beijing itself. Manchu forces crossed the Great Wall and approached the capital. Panic spread faster than cavalry. Garrisons hesitated. Officials debated. Qin Liangyu did not wait for reimbursement. She used her own resources to provision her soldiers and march toward the capital. A frontier commander entered the political center with a functioning army. That was the difference. At Pingtai, the emperor faced a calculation. Around him stood ministers trained in ritual and precedent. Before him stood a regional Tusi commander who had fought rebels, Manchu cavalry, and bureaucratic hostility. She had buried a brother. She had lost a husband to court intrigue. She had kept her territory stable. If he rejected her, he rejected one of the few forces still capable of action. If he embraced her, he admitted that survival outweighed convention. He chose survival. The poems were not decoration. They were authorization. They compared her to ancient strategists. They questioned the courage of men who hesitated. They placed her name in the same register as established generals. In that moment, Qin Liangyu ceased to be merely a frontier commander. She became a statement. When the empire thinned, it relied on whoever could still hold the line. The line she held was not drawn on flat ground. In the southwest, mountains replaced walls. Ravines replaced moats. Armies that moved in neat ranks on northern plains fractured on Sichuan stone. Qin Liangyu understood that terrain was not an obstacle to overcome. It was a weapon to shape. From that understanding came the White Pole Army. Its signature weapon was the white ash spear. The shaft remained unpainted to preserve grip and flexibility. The iron tip carried a forward hook capable of dragging a rider from the saddle or catching stone edges during ascent. At the base, a heavy iron ring balanced the weight and created a locking point. The innovation was not the spear alone. It was what soldiers could do with it together. They linked the iron rings. They anchored shafts into cracks along cliff faces. They created fixed lines across narrow gaps. In broken terrain where cavalry could not maneuver and conventional infantry lost formation, the White Pole troops climbed, flanked, and struck from angles the enemy considered unreachable. Mountain warfare followed a simple rule. If you cannot move, you lose. If you move where others cannot, you dictate the fight. This doctrine shaped their engagements. Rather than frontal assaults across exposed slopes, they approached from ridgelines. Rather than contest open ground against faster cavalry, they forced opponents into constrained passages. Mobility replaced mass. Surprise replaced spectacle. The result was not myth, it was pattern. When Zhang Xianzhong's rebellion spread into Sichuan during the 1630s, entire prefectures collapsed. Administration disintegrated. Grain stores were seized or burned. Refugees flooded the roads. Violence did not distinguish between soldier and civilian. Shizhu did not fall. In 1634, Qin Liangyu and her son Ma Xianglin defeated rebel forces at Quezhou. The victory did not end the insurgency, but it prevented the collapse of a corridor that linked the upper Yangtze to the interior. She preserved a zone of order while neighboring territories descended into massacre. Governance followed war. She expanded cultivation within Shizhu to secure food supply. Fields were reclaimed. Production stabilized. Troops remained disciplined. Plunder was restricted. Civilians were not treated as expendable resources. In an empire where armies often survived by extracting from exhausted populations, this distinction mattered. Nearly 100,000 refugees entered Shizhu seeking safety. They were not turned away. They were settled, organized, and incorporated into agricultural production. Stability became reinforcement. A protected population became a labor base. The labor base sustained the army. It was not charity alone. It was structural defense. War demands grain. Grain demands people. Protect the people and the war can continue. Yet beyond Shizhu, the empire continued to fracture. The treasury strained under campaigns in Liaodong. Climate fluctuations associated with the Little Ice Age reduced harvests across northern provinces. Taxation intensified to compensate for military expenditure. Desperation widened recruitment for rebel leaders such as Zicheng. Administrative corruption corroded trust between officials and local communities. Qin Liangyu's model worked because it was coherent. It unified command, supply, and civil protection within a defined territory. It relied on loyalty reinforced by performance. But it remained regional. A single functioning node cannot stabilize a failing network. Meanwhile, resistance within the court persisted. Her earlier memorial criticizing incompetent male commanders did not endear her to entrenched interests. Her position as a woman and as a frontier, Tusi compounded suspicion. Recognition from the emperor shielded her from overt marginalization, but it did not dissolve resentment. Authority in crisis often invites envy. Still, she continued to act. When Beijing fell in 1644 and the Ming court fragmented southward, she was already in her 70s. Many commanders calculated survival. Allegiance became fluid. Regions negotiated with advancing Qing forces. She did not shift. She declared loyalty to the southern Ming regime. Titles followed. She was named Zhongzhen, a marquess. She received the position of Grand Protector of the Crown Prince. These honors were rare for any subject. For a woman, they were nearly unprecedented. The titles confirmed what decades of command had established. She was not an auxiliary figure. She was a pillar. Even then, the broader tide did not reverse. Qing consolidation advanced. Southern resistance fractured. Age limited mobility. Yet until her death in 1648, she remained engaged in training and inspection. Accounts describe her falling from a horse during review, weakened but still active. She did not witness restoration. She witnessed endurance. Empires fall through accumulated failures. Individuals cannot always halt that descent, but they can determine how collapse unfolds in the spaces they control. In Shizhu, collapse did not become chaos. That was her victory. Her death in 1648 did not end the war. It ended a particular way of fighting it. By then, the Ming state as she had known it no longer existed. Beijing had fallen. The Qing consolidated in the north. Southern Ming courts rose and fractured in succession. Loyalties were tested by fatigue, famine, and inevitability. Qin Liangyu did not live to see resolution. She lived long enough to see transformation. She had been born in 1574 when the Ming still projected confidence. She died in a landscape redrawn by invasion and rebellion. Between those two dates stretched more than 40 years of continuous command. Few generals of the era sustained that span without disgrace, defection, or annihilation. Her distinction did not lie in undefeated campaigns. She suffered losses. Her brother Qin Bangping died at the Hun River. Her husband Ma Qiancheng died in prison after political accusations. Her son Ma Xianglin fell in battle during the internal wars. Her house paid the same price demanded of common soldiers. What separated her was persistence under erosion. In official historiography, this persistence received unusual recognition. The Mingxi placed her biography among military commanders, rather than in the section reserved for exemplary women. That placement mattered. Traditional Lai Nu narratives praised chastity, filial devotion, or self-sacrifice within domestic boundaries. Qin Liangyu was recorded for battlefield leadership, administrative authority, and strategic competence. The classification was not rhetorical generosity. It reflected function. She held official command. She levied troops. She managed taxation within her jurisdiction. She negotiated directly with the court. She received imperial poetry not as a moral emblem, but as a military asset. In a Confucian political culture structured by hierarchy and gender prescription, such acknowledgement required justification. That justification was performance during crisis. When survival is at stake, systems bend. Yet bending does not erase tension. Even as she was honored, she operated within a state suffering systemic breakdown. The Little Ice Age contributed to repeated harvest failures. Fiscal deficits deepened under prolonged campaigns in Liaodong. Military units elsewhere resorted to predation against civilians when supply faltered. The rupture between army and population accelerated rebellion. Her governance model in Shizhu stood in contrast. She integrated civil stability and military readiness. Refugees became cultivators. Cultivators fed soldiers. Soldiers protected fields. Authority derived from reliability. But scale defines outcome. An empire requires replication of effective practice across provinces. The Ming lacked that cohesion by the 1640s. Regional strength could not compensate for metropolitan paralysis and fiscal exhaustion. The Qing advance was not simply a triumph of cavalry. It was the collapse of a structure unable to sustain simultaneous external and internal war. Qin Liangyu's career unfolded within that structural failure. She mitigated it locally. She could not reverse it nationally. After her death, memory began its own campaign. Physical sites in Shizhu preserved her presence. Tombs, temples, steles, and armor displayed continuity. Local tradition emphasized martial heritage. Her story circulated as testimony that frontier societies were not peripheral but central to defense. In later centuries, reformers and activists reframed her image. During the late Qing, figures such as Qu Jin invoked her as proof that women could participate directly in national struggle. The narrative shifted from frontier defense to gender emancipation. She became a symbol beyond her original context. In the 21st century, popular culture extended that transformation. Digital games and serialized media introduced her to global audiences. The white pole spear and imperial poems survived in stylized form. The systemic crisis of late Ming governance often did not. This is the pattern of legacy. Institutions record function, communities preserve memory, later generations reshape both to fit new battles. What remains constant is the record in the Ming Shi. A woman stands among generals, not because she defied ritual alone, but because she commanded forces that altered outcomes. She did not ask to redefine gender categories. She responded to strategic demand. When mountains required specialized troops, she built them. When rebellion threatened corridors, she secured them. When the capital faltered, she marched. Her career illustrates a larger principle. Competence does not guarantee victory over structural decay. But without competence, decay accelerates. If the late Ming had possessed multiple regions, governed with her discipline and integrated supply model, the timeline of collapse might have shifted. History does not confirm that possibility. It records that one commander sustained order where she could. She did not prevent the dynasty's fall. She delayed disorder within her reach. That is a quieter form of power. History rarely forgets by accident. It forgets by compression. The transition from Ming to Qing reorganized archives, loyalties, and narratives. The compilers of the Ming Shi worked under Qing authority. They recorded Qin Liangyu as a general, yet her story occupied a limited frame within a vast chronicle of dynastic failure. Her presence survived, but the scale of the crisis that made her necessary gradually receded from public memory. What endured was the image of an exceptional woman. What faded was the structure she operated inside. Late Ming China was not a static Confucian order disrupted overnight. It was a system strained by climate volatility, fiscal exhaustion, frontier warfare, and internal insurgency. The Tusi arrangement in the southwest represented pragmatic decentralization. It allowed regional leaders to maintain localized stability while pledging military service to the throne. Qin Liangyu's authority emerged through that mechanism. She did not overthrow hierarchy. She functioned within it and expanded its limits through competence. Her power derived from formal appointment, military success, and the emperor's explicit endorsement. She was neither rebel nor symbol of private virtue. She was a state actor. This distinction matters. When later generations recast her as a romantic heroine or a martial archetype, they often detach her from administrative detail. Yet her effectiveness depended on administration. Grain quotas, refugee settlement, discipline enforcement, and supply management shaped every campaign she undertook. War in her case was not spectacle. It was logistics sustained over decades. Her white pole army illustrates this continuity. The innovation of linking spear shafts for mountain mobility was tactical. The maintenance of such a unit over years required training cycles, resource allocation, and cultural cohesion among Tujia and Han soldiers. Technique without structure dissolves. She preserved both. The moral dimension of her career is therefore institutional rather than sentimental. She did not simply fight bravely. She maintained order when the surrounding order deteriorated. She held together a regional network of command, cultivation, and protection. That cohesion created refuge for tens of thousands during rebellion. It demonstrated that governance could function even as imperial centers faltered. Yet empires measure success by scale. The Ming collapse culminated in 1644 with the fall of Beijing to Zicheng, followed by Qing consolidation. Southern Ming courts continued resistance, but fragmentation limited coordination. Qin Liangyu aligned with them, out of loyalty, not expectation of restoration. By then she was advanced in age, yet she continued to supervise defenses. Her life traced the arc of a dynasty from maturity to dissolution. Few individuals embody that full span. The final question is not whether she won every campaign. She did not. Nor is it whether she transcended gender norms in a permanent sense. After her era, the system reverted largely to precedent. The deeper question is structural. What determines whether a state survives simultaneous internal revolt and external invasion? Resources matter. Climate matters. Leadership matters. Qin Liangyu supplied leadership and local. The Ming lacked consistent replication of that model across provinces. If one region functions while others fail, collapse slows but does not reverse. Her legacy, therefore, is neither triumphalist nor tragic in isolation. It is diagnostic. It reveals what sustained governance looks like under stress. It shows how flexible hierarchies can become when necessity overrides prejudice. It demonstrates that frontier forces, often dismissed as peripheral, can anchor national defense. She did not ask to be exceptional. She responded to demand. When the empire thinned, she reinforced its edges. When the center hesitated, she acted. When collapse approached, she refused to dissolve with it. If the Ming court had possessed 10 commanders operating with similar integration of military and civil strategy, the timeline might have extended. That is speculation, not record. What record confirms is singular endurance. The Ming Shi preserves her name among generals. Shizhu preserves her tomb and temples. Reformers invoked her as precedent. Popular culture reshaped her for new audiences. Between those layers stands the historical figure. A woman born in 1574 in Zhang, a commander who marched to Beijing in 1630, a Marcus under the southern Ming, a defender who died in 1648 with her territory intact. Empires fall through accumulated weakness. She did not prevent the fall. She prevented surrender where she stood. There is a temptation to isolate Qin Liangyu as an anomaly, a rare figure who appears briefly and disappears once the dynasty collapses. That reading is convenient because it preserves the larger narrative of inevitable decline. It suggests that even brilliance cannot matter against structural decay. Yet her career complicates that simplicity. She did not operate outside the system. She exposed both its fragility and its remaining capacity for adaptation. The late Ming state was not uniformly incompetent. It was uneven. In some regions, corruption hollowed authority. In others, logistical chains broke under fiscal pressure. But in Shizhu, governance aligned with military necessity. That alignment was not accidental. It was constructed deliberately through discipline, agricultural stabilization, and strict control over troops. When other armies resorted to looting to survive, her forces retained cohesion because supply had been planned in advance. Civilian trust endured. Trust preserved manpower. Manpower preserved defense. The chain was simple but rare. Her authority also reveals the political elasticity of the Ming court under existential threat. Confucian orthodoxy prescribed clear gender hierarchy, yet when survival required capable commanders, those prescriptions bent. The emperor's poems were not romantic indulgence, they were political signaling. By elevating her publicly, he sent a message to both court and frontier. Loyalty and effectiveness would be recognized regardless of origin. That signal had limits, but it mattered in a climate of suspicion. At the same time, the court's dependence on figures like Qin Liangyu exposed structural weakness. Reliance on regional strongholds indicated declining central coordination. The Tusi system functioned because it delegated power outward. Delegation provided flexibility but reduced uniform control. In times of prosperity, such decentralization could coexist with imperial authority. In prolonged crisis, it risked fragmentation. Qin Liangyu never leveraged her position for autonomy. She remained aligned with the throne even when the throne faltered. Her stance during the Southern Ming period reinforces this point. By the 1640s, many leaders faced a strategic choice between accommodation with Qing forces and continued resistance under weakening Ming claimants. She chose continuity of allegiance. That choice did not alter the final outcome, but it clarified her priorities. She defined legitimacy, not by momentum but by oath. Her death did not immediately erase the structures she built, but without her personal command, the model gradually dissolved into the broader Qing administrative framework. Individual capacity can fortify a region, yet institutions must outlive individuals to preserve long-term autonomy. Shizhu eventually integrated into the Qing system. What remained was memory anchored in official historiography and local commemoration. If history remembers her only as a rare female commander, it misses the deeper lesson. She combined frontier martial culture with classical military study. She merged regional autonomy with imperial loyalty. She aligned civil administration with battlefield necessity. She did not rewrite destiny. She resisted entropy. Memory simplifies. Structure explains. If we return to the late Ming crisis without romance, Qin Liangyu's career becomes less an exception and more a diagnostic lens. The dynasty did not fall because it lacked brave soldiers. It fell because coordination failed under compounded stress. Climate disruption reduced harvests across northern provinces. Military expenditure in Liaodong drained silver reserves. Tax burdens intensified while administrative corruption eroded legitimacy. Rebellions under Zicheng and Zhang Xianzhong did not erupt in a vacuum. They expanded through spaces where governance had already weakened. Against that background, Shizhu functioned differently. It was not wealthy. It was not strategically central like Beijing or Nanjing. Yet it maintained cohesion. The reason was not geography alone. Mountain terrain offered defense, but terrain without organization becomes isolation. Qin Liangyu fused local martial tradition with disciplined command. She integrated Tujia Highland fighters into a structure that answered to imperial authority. She maintained supply through agricultural stabilization. She restrained her troops from predation. War under her command followed a rule of alignment. Logistics supported movement. Movement supported tactical advantage. Tactical advantage protected civilians. Civilian stability replenished logistics. The cycle reinforced itself. Elsewhere in the empire, that cycle broke. Armies consumed what they defended. Officials delayed decisions. Factionalism at court obstructed coordination. When Beijing fell in 1644, it was not because defenders lacked courage. It was because the system could not synchronize response across fronts. Qin Liangyu's presence at Beijing in 1630 had symbolized possibility. A frontier commander had marched to the capital and contributed to its defense. The emperor had publicly affirmed her authority. For a moment, center and frontier aligned. But alignment requires repetition. It requires replication across provinces and ministries. One functioning corridor cannot compensate for multiple collapsing ones. Her loyalty during the Southern Ming period underscores another dimension. She did not rebrand herself under Qing authority to secure local advantage. She did not transform Shizhu into a separatist enclave. She remained committed to the Ming claim, even as its territorial control shrank. That decision limited her political flexibility but preserved consistency of principle. Consistency matters in transitional eras. It anchors identity when institutions fracture. When she received the title Zhongzhenhu and the office of Grand Protector of the Crown Prince, the honors acknowledged more than battlefield record. They recognized sustained reliability. In Chinese political tradition, Marquess rank signified trust at the highest level of governance. For a woman to receive such rank was extraordinary. For a frontier commander to receive it during dynastic collapse was strategic necessity. After her death in 1648, Qing consolidation gradually absorbed remaining resistance. Administrative reforms replaced the Ming framework. The Tusi system itself would later face restructuring under Qing policy. The regional autonomy that had enabled Qin Liangyu's rise became subject to tighter imperial integration. Structural adaptation continued, but under a new dynasty. What remains, therefore, is not an unresolved war story, but a study in bounded impact. She extended stability in a defined territory for decades. She demonstrated that disciplined regional governance could mitigate systemic failure. She proved that gender hierarchy could yield under pressure when competence became indispensable. But she also revealed limits. Individual excellence cannot compensate indefinitely for fiscal exhaustion, climatic volatility, and fragmented command across an empire of immense scale. Structural reform must precede collapse, not follow it. Her life traced the arc between adaptation and inevitability. She adapted. The dynasty did not adapt fast enough. If we ask what her legacy demands, it is not admiration alone. It is clarity. Empires survive when logistics, legitimacy, and leadership reinforce one another. They fail when those elements detach. Qin Liangyu managed to bind them together within Shizhu. The Ming state failed to bind them across China. She did not become legendary because she shattered convention. She became consequential because she functioned when the system faltered. That is a quieter standard of greatness. To understand why Qin Liangyu still unsettles historical categories, we have to return to the question of record. In traditional dynastic histories, placement determines meaning. A biography among generals affirms command authority. A biography among exemplary women affirms moral virtue. Qin Liangyu was placed with commanders. That editorial decision made under Qing's supervision preserved a fact that could not be reduced to sentiment. She exercised state power. She commanded troops not as symbolic inspiration, but as operational authority. She issued orders that moved men across provinces. She coordinated reinforcements toward Liaodong. She mobilized provisions at her own expense to relieve Beijing. She managed refugee settlement on a scale approaching 100,000 people. These actions fall within the domain of governance, not legend. The distinction is critical, because later memory often prefers narrative clarity over structural complexity. It is easier to remember her as a real Mulan than to reconstruct the fiscal and logistical realities of late Ming defense. Yet the latter defines her true weight. She did not disguise herself to enter war. She was formally recognized, formally appointed, and formally honored. The anomaly was not deception. The anomaly was institutional flexibility under pressure. The Ming state, though weakened, retained the capacity to reward performance. That capacity delayed total collapse. Qin Liangyu's career demonstrates that central authority still functioned in selective moments. The emperor could evaluate, elevate, and legitimize. The problem was not absolute paralysis. It was inconsistency. Consistency requires stable revenue. Stable revenue requires agricultural security. Agricultural security requires protection from both external invasion and internal predation. When climate fluctuation reduced yields and armies requisitioned grain without compensation, that chain fractured. Rebellion filled the vacuum. Shizhu avoided that full fracture for decades because protection preceded extraction. Troops defended fields before drawing from them. Refugees became cultivators rather than burdens. Discipline restrained short-term exploitation in favor of long-term sustainability. This model resembles modern principles of counterinsurgency and territorial defense, though separated by centuries. Control terrain, secure population, maintain supply, align legitimacy with protection. Qin Liangyu practiced these principles without theoretical vocabulary. She applied them because the alternative was visible in neighboring prefectures, depopulation and chaos. Her endurance across 4 decades of conflict also reveals personal resilience shaped by early formation. Educated alongside her brothers in both classical texts and martial practice, she entered adulthood already prepared for strategic reasoning. Her marriage into the Ma family connected scholarly training with frontier military culture. The synthesis created capacity. Capacity then met crisis. Crisis elevated her beyond conventional boundaries. Yet elevation did not guarantee insulation. Court politics claimed her husband's life. Bureaucratic suspicion shadowed her authority. She responded not with withdrawal, but with continued service. In 1623, she submitted a memorial criticizing ineffective commanders who avoided battle while obstructing those willing to fight. That document signals confidence not only in her own ability, but in her right to evaluate peers. Such confidence did not erase gender norms across society. It demonstrated that norms could bend when survival required recalibration. After the dynasty fell, those recalibrations receded. The Qing administration incorporated her memory without replicating her precedent widely. This reversion underscores a broader pattern. Crisis expands possibility. Stability narrows it again. Qin Liangyu lived at the intersection of expansion and collapse. She expanded what was permissible for a woman within state command because collapse made competence non-negotiable. Once, a new order consolidated institutional conservatism reasserted itself. Therefore, her legacy is double-edged. She is proof that systems can adapt under pressure. She is also proof that adaptation may not endure beyond crisis. What remains indisputable is her record. Born in 1574 in Zhangzhou, married into the Tusi structure in 1595. Victorious in Bojo, reinforcing Liaodong, marching to Beijing in 1630, governing Shizhu through rebellion, honored as Zhang, loyal until death in 1648. The empire collapsed. Her command did not.